TLDR, don't mess with the IT guy. He knows how to make the system work for him, and when it all goes down, it's a complete disaster for everyone else. So, I was sitting with a friend, and we were just talking about random things when he brought up this insane story. It wasn't even his story, but rather his brother's, and when he started describing it, I knew this had to be shared here. I was sitting on the edge of my seat, barely able to keep my eyes off him as he recounted every detail. This isn't your typical office drama, this one's got it all. Betrayal, corporate greed, revenge, and an IT guy who knew exactly how to turn the tables. Trust me, you'll want to hear the full story. It's long, but it's totally worth it, so grab a snack and buckle up. Let's call the main guy Bob. Now, Bob wasn't just your average IT guy. He'd been tinkering with computers since he was a kid. He was that nerdy kid who could figure out how to fix any technical issue and loved doing it. For Bob, solving computer problems was like solving puzzles, and there was a deep satisfaction in getting everything to run smoothly. But as you know, being an IT guy isn't just about fixing things, it's about navigating the mess that is office politics. And Bob had that down to a science. He wasn't just skilled with tech, he knew how to read a room, how to figure out the politics of a company, and how to ensure that people knew he was an essential asset. Over the years, he moved between jobs, refining his skills, expanding his knowledge, and learning how to protect his value in an industry that was always changing. Bob wasn't just a cog in the machine, he was the one who kept it running. And the moment he felt like he was being undervalued, he knew how to make sure the machine couldn't run without him. Bob had worked for a service and distribution company based in Ontario, Canada. The company wasn't massive, but it wasn't tiny either. It had a decent-sized staff and a decent-sized operation. The kind of company that had enough moving parts that it needed a dedicated IT team to keep the business running smoothly. But despite its size, the company's IT systems were a disaster. They had an old system in place, separate software for dispatching, inventory, payroll, and finance. These systems didn't communicate with each other, so the employees constantly had to jump from one program to another, entering data multiple times, dealing with inconsistencies, and wasting precious hours on tasks that should have taken minutes. The whole thing was a mess. Bob came in and immediately saw the issue. The company needed a real solution, something that could bring all their data and processes together under one roof. The company needed an ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning, system. And Bob knew exactly which one would work best for them. He'd worked with this exact ERP system at a previous job and knew it inside and out. It wasn't going to be a quick fix, but Bob was confident he could pull it off. He'd done it before. The company agreed, and Bob dove headfirst into the implementation of the ERP system. It wasn't going to be easy, far from it. Bob spent countless hours tweaking the system, adjusting it to meet the company's needs. Employees had to be trained on how to use the new software, and that was no small feat. Each department had to be trained on their specific portion of the system, whether it was inventory, payroll, or dispatching. And Bob had to answer all their questions, troubleshoot issues, and make sure everything was running smoothly. But here's the thing about ERP systems, they're complex. Most employees didn't really get the whole picture, they just wanted to do their jobs, and Bob found himself caught in the middle of their frustration and the company's expectations. They didn't care how much work Bob was putting in, they just wanted things to work. So, while Bob was drowning in a sea of requests and training sessions, he kept his head down and powered through. But after months of blood, sweat, and tears, the system was finally up and running. Employees were still frustrated, but everything was functioning better than before. Bob had worked his tail off, and now he could finally breathe easy, or so he thought. Enter the expansion. The company started reaching into new markets across Canada, opening up their customer base to both the Atlantic and Pacific time zones. This, as you can imagine, threw everything into chaos. Suddenly, the once manageable flow of emails and orders became a jumbled mess of time zone discrepancies. Employees in Atlantic, Canada would send emails at 8 a.m. their time, but Bob wouldn't get them until 6:30 a.m. Ontario time. Meanwhile, employees in Vancouver would send messages at 3 p.m. their time, and Bob wouldn't see them until 6 p.m. This stretched out the workday in all directions, and soon it became clear that the company was not prepared for this kind of expansion. Staff were coming in early, staying late, and doing everything they could to adjust to these timing gaps. But the real issue was that Bob was still expected to handle everything. No matter the time of day, no matter when the issue came in, Bob was the one who had to fix it. It didn't matter that it was 6 a.m. or 9 p.m. If someone had a question or a problem, Bob was supposed to be there to help. His phone rang constantly, and his inbox was flooded. It didn't help that the company had a policy where if something broke, Bob was expected to fix it immediately. And if he didn't respond fast enough, people would get frustrated and escalate things to management. The pressure was crushing. It wasn't just the ERP system anymore, it was everything. Bob was running on fumes, but he had to keep going. There was no other choice. By this point, Bob had been doing the job of two people for months. So when the company finally decided to stagger Bob's shifts to ease the pressure, Bob thought it might help. But it quickly became clear that the solution they came up with was anything but. The company decided Bob would start at 6 a.m. and finish at 2:30 p.m., while his colleague would start at 10:30 a.m. and work until 7 p.m. But Bob's colleague had kids and didn't want to deal with that early shift. So when the company insisted, the colleague quit. Boom. Now, Bob was the only IT person left to handle everything. The company promised they'd hire someone to fill the position, but that never happened. They posted the job, but the salary they offered was a joke, way below what Bob knew someone with ERP expertise should be getting. Bob, knowing he was irreplaceable at this point, asked for a raise. His request was denied. Bob didn't stop there. He asked for overtime compensation. The company told him no, saying he was exempt from overtime pay because he was in IT. Bob looked up the law to make sure they were right, and sure enough, they were. But just because they were technically right didn't mean Bob was happy about it. The company was pushing him to work more and more, and yet they weren't offering him anything in return. It wasn't fair, and Bob knew that. He knew something had to change, and if the company wasn't going to take care of him, he'd make sure they felt the consequences. That's when Bob started plotting. He wasn't just going to leave quietly. Oh no, this wasn't the end. Bob had full access to the ERP system, which meant he had access to everything. And when you have access to the system that tracks employee hours and data, you have power. So Bob did something that very few people would even think of. He ran a report for every non-manager employee, going all the way back to when the ERP system had first been implemented. He tracked every single hour worked, every single overtime hour, and found a shocking truth: the majority of employees had been working well past the 44-hour workweek threshold. And under Ontario law, they were legally entitled to overtime pay. Bob, being the savvy guy that he was, knew exactly what to do next. He reached out to an employment lawyer to get a second opinion and make sure he wasn't stepping into legal hot water. The lawyer gave him the green light. Bob, knowing he had everything lined up, put his plan into action. He started looking for another job, got an offer, and handed in his resignation. But before he left, he had one final act of revenge. Bob sent one last email to the entire company with the subject line, "You're legally entitled to overtime pay." In the email, he attached an Excel sheet that listed every employee's hours, showing how many hours they'd worked beyond 44 hours a week. And in the body of the email was the contact information for the lawyer, along with instructions on how employees could contact him to file claims for their unpaid overtime. Bob wasn't just walking away, he was setting the company on fire. And that's exactly what happened. The company was completely blindsided. Within hours, employees started flooding the lawyer with calls. They were angry, they were ready, and most importantly, they deserved this compensation. What could the company have done to avoid this disaster? They could have simply paid Bob what he was owed. They could have treated him fairly and compensated him for all the extra hours he'd been putting in. But instead, they had to pay out everyone. Bob had played the game flawlessly, and it was a game that the company was never going to win. The lawyer quickly got to work, and soon the company was facing a massive wave of legal action. Almost every single employee who received that email authorized the lawyer to represent them, and the claims began to pile up. The company was suddenly drowning in overtime pay claims, and what had started as a simple, straightforward case of corporate greed turned into an absolute financial disaster. Bob had left the company, but his mark was left all over the place. The employees, who had been overworked and underappreciated for so long, finally had a weapon in their hands, thanks to Bob's insider knowledge and the leverage he had over the company's system. The company was forced to settle with most of the employees, agreeing to pay out substantial amounts in back pay for overtime hours that had gone unclaimed for far too long. The cost of doing the right thing was far higher than it would have been if they had simply taken care of Bob when they had the chance. As word spread about what Bob had done, the company was forced to reevaluate their entire approach. Their reputation was in tatters. Employees who had previously felt powerless now knew that they had a voice, and it was Bob's quiet, calculated actions that had given them that voice. Bob, on the other hand, walked away with his new job and a sense of satisfaction that few people ever get the chance to experience. He didn't just leave his old company, he left it shattered. The employees who had once complained about the complexity of the ERP system now realized that the true complexity had never been in the system itself, but in the company's management. And Bob, the one person who had always been there to fix things, had taken matters into his own hands when no one else would. It's a cautionary tale for any company that thinks they can take advantage of the people who keep the wheels turning. You can't expect employees to give their all if you're not willing to give back. And don't ever underestimate the power of an IT guy who knows how the system works. Bob wasn't just a cog in the machine, he was the one who made it run, and when it was time to stop being taken for granted, he made sure the entire system came crashing down. The company learned the hard way: respect your employees, or they'll find a way to make sure you regret it.